First of all, let me thank Mayor Scott for organizing this meeting of the town hall meeting with the stakeholders here this afternoon, this evening, so that we can have a discussion about the issue of crime management and crime control and what is the best way forward. I also want to thank all of you for coming out, because I know that, generally speaking, just trying to make my way here, that getting into and out of Spanish Town is a difficult problem, a challenge each day. And it's almost the same thing getting into and around Kingston because of all the road activities, but that's another issue. I think the starting point for any discussion of the issue of crime management and crime control should be that we are, all of us, every single one of us in this room, anxious, urgently anxious, that we overcome the terrible monster of criminal violence which has beset our communities and indeed our country for too long. And certainly, we in the opposition, we in the People's National Party, have a very earnest commitment to the fight against crime and violence and criminality. Let me acknowledge also at the outset that not only in St. Catherine, but since we are in St. Catherine, that you have a particularly severe problem of criminal violence in this community and in this town. And I say that because it's not a problem which emerged yesterday or even 9 months ago. It's a problem that has been with us for some time, and some of the most grievous and heinous and intolerable crimes have been committed in these communities. Murders of families, criminals rampaging with guns across communities. Let us acknowledge that that sadly has been part of the reality that you have had to face and we have all had to face in the country. Indeed, we can also acknowledge that at the point when the state of emergency was declared, things were bad. The issue that arises, and indeed it was also the case in St. James, particularly when it was declared. You have had a state of emergency for 9 months approximately. St. James, which is not yet expired, has had a state of emergency for a year. The question that arises is whether we can say, first of all, that the state of emergency lasting for 6 months, whether that, and this is the point argued by Dr. Barnett, whether the emergency has lasted for 6 months or a year, and whether in that circumstance it remains legal, constitutional, in keeping with the Constitution. And I can say definitively, we can go into it in greater detail in the question time, our Constitution, framers of the Constitution, never intended a state of emergency to be a long-term crime control measure. As Dr. Barnett argues, an emergency is something that occurs suddenly, is largely unforeseen, and in the terms of the Constitution, threatens the very survival of the state. For that reason, whether it's natural disaster or man-made disaster, it suspends all the rights that the citizen has. Your right to your property, your right to move about freely, your right to associate freely, your right to liberty without going to a court of law. And it gives enormous powers to the security forces and to state authorities to seize your property, to confine you to your residence, to separate you from your family, to do all of these things. It was never intended as a long-term measure. The proof of that, governments can only pass it and keep it in force for 2 weeks. And then it says you have to go to the parliament. And you have to get 2/3 of the parliament agreeing that an emergency exists. That means, that is to say, that provision was put in there because the emergency should be visible to everybody that is an emergency. Like if you were to have, God forbid, a natural disaster, hurricane, earthquake, or something like that, or a disease spread across the country, killing off people, or you had a group of people that decided they were going to use armed force to challenge the state, or you were at war with another country. That was what was intended by the framers of the Constitution. And clearly they also felt, because even an extension couldn't be given for more than 3 months, which again underscores the original thinking that this emergency, in the nature of emergency, like you have a fire go out. Fire is an emergency. When it goes out, the emergency is done. You still have mopping up operations to do. You still have to rebuild the house if it's a house fire or factory or whatever. You still have a lot of things arising, but the fire finished. And so I restate the point, it was never intended to be a long-term crime control measure. States need to put measures in place to control crime as a part of the normal activity of states everywhere. In the specific case of the declaration of states of emergency, here, once we were persuaded, after we consulted with the constitutional experts, the lawyers, once we were persuaded that the Constitution did not intend this long-term thing, we had, first of all, to decide on the basis of our own conscience. Because sometimes, we all know political expediency, and we are politicians, but there is a time when you need to be guided by not what is expedient, but by what is right. And you cannot hope to ask people to observe the law while yourself breaking the law. It is to bring the law itself into disrepute. And we know, God knows, we have too much disrespect for law and order in the country. And therefore, the first place where respect for law should occur is in the place that pass laws, which is the Parliament. And the Constitution was modified in 2011 with the introduction of a Charter of Rights. And the Charter of Rights lists all the rights that the citizen has and says these rights can only be taken away in a manner that is evidently fair and demonstrably democratic, and as would operate in free and democratic societies around the globe. That means now that is the test that we must apply. And our Constitution puts a particular responsibility in the framing of it on an opposition to protect the constitutional rights of the people. Now, what has occurred? Up to the numbers that we had in December, what you had across the island is in excess of 10,000 persons detained. Less than 3% of them charged before a court. There were less tribunals were set up, as is required by the emergency regulations. Less than 50 persons got to see a tribunal out in St. James, where they had in excess of 3,000 plus arrested, detained. In St. Catherine, which had the largest number of detainees, not one detainee was able to get before a tribunal. Not one. The lawyers, and we met with some of the civil rights groups, they were told that they couldn't get before. Well, first of all, nobody knew location of the tribunal. So you could carry a request to the tribunal. And then you needed a lawyer to get to the tribunal, which put it beyond the reach, quite frankly, of many of the young men detained. And I say young men because it's largely young men and largely, almost exclusively, poor people. Now, there are some who say, but these people who are detained come from communities where there are criminals. That is not a basis for taking away anyone's right to liberty without giving them an opportunity to go to a court. But the more important question to be answered is whether this approach to policing carries with it the prospect of a real improvement in the conditions of safety and security that we all seek. And certainly what it would seem is that in the circumstances where you have this widespread detention, even if people say the average detention is 1 week, it is only acceptable if it's not you or your child. And that is and has been the problem with Jamaica, in that the average citizen doesn't feel that they have an equal place and equal rights in the country. And we keep subjecting a large part of the population to a reality where in effect they have no rights. And therefore, that approach to policing, while it might give you short-term relief, is sowing the seeds of a longer-term crisis which the country would have to face up to. The truth is, it is part of a pattern which we have tried for a long time in this country. A pattern of what I call suppression of crime policing. We've been there before. In the 1970s, an administration of the PNP passed suppression of crime legislation, removed the requirements for things like search warrant and all of those detentions provided for it. And I dare say, because it was a PNP government that instituted it, and it was a PNP government that rescinded it in the 90s. And in that period, crime never went down. Crime continued to grow. More and more gangs got formed. More and more arms circulated through communities. And worst of all, the relationship between the communities and the security forces deteriorated. And the only way we'll ever succeed in taming the monster of crime is when you are able to build a seamless, mutually trusting relationship between the security forces and the broad majority of citizens. And this approach was not doing that. Suppression of crime policing talks about sending large numbers of security forces largely into communities with a majority of poor people, with indiscriminate and widespread detention. It is suppression, stopping people moving, etc. In the year when we had 3 states of emergency, there were fewer convictions, fewer guns and ammunition seized than in the previous years. Last year, 2018, crime and murder went down, but fewer convictions for serious crimes. Fewer guns seized, fewer ammunition than the year before. And indeed, if you look at the numbers going down after the original shock and awe, which a state of emergency is intended to cause, as the point was made earlier, once people get used to it, it stops having the effect. But it is having an effect on all those people detained and who are, unless you're going to keep it there forever, which would make us something other than a normal democratic society, then what you are doing is creating a basis for sustained hostility between a large number of citizens and the authorities of the state. We have been that way before. The fact of the matter is that the only way forward for our country and for effective crime control is not what I would call suppression policing, but intelligence-led investigative policing, which has the capacity for identifying criminals through effective intelligence gathering, preparing proper cases, taking those cases before a court of law, securing a conviction, and taking the criminals out of the community and putting them in prison or bringing them to justice in some other way. That's the only long-term solution. But the truth is, to do that, requires a much more sustained commitment of resources to the security forces than we have done. Because in effect, and for a long time, we have been putting the security forces on the front line and basically giving them a basket to carry water. Now, I am not going to pretend that that happened last year or 2016. Although, I am also not going to pretend that the crisis that had to be arrested last year is a crisis that could have been avoided. We kept saying in the budget debate that enough resources had not been provided for the security forces. We raised issues when used cars were being ordered for the police force and they got none. All now the cars don't come. So you can't ask police to confront the criminal reality and starve them of cars. And when you do get car, you cut the money for gas. So police have to walk around and beg gas or park the car. It cannot work. But my point now, when we hear that revenues are exceeding targets and that the worst of the economic crisis is over, then is that in the additional resources that are available to the country, a significant share of those resources, and we'll be looking in the coming budget, must be made available for the reform and equipping of the security forces. And I mean specifically the Jamaica Constabulary Force. In the face of what is the highest murder rate in the Caribbean, and Jamaica is number 5, let's say, worldwide as far as murders per 100,000 of population. We have among the lowest ratio of police to population. So we have about 1 to 300 and something, 365 or something like that. You need about double that. So what we should be doing is not detaining large numbers of people to indefinite detention. We should be recruiting and employing greater numbers of security forces, providing additional training, and I dare say additional pay to attract the quality of human resources that we need. We need a major outlay in mobility, that is to say motor cars, motorbikes, and all the other things that are needed. We need enhanced training. We need intelligence gathering equipment. We need an intelligence collection act, because one of the things that free and democratic societies have is proper independent supervision of secure intelligence collection. Because in the hands of irresponsible people, it can be misused. And the technology is moving at such a pace to allow for the gathering of intelligence that we need now to modernize our legislative framework quickly, so that we don't go down some wrong paths as we modernize. We need to re-examine legislation like the anti-gang legislation to make it more effective. It's going through a process in Parliament now. We were pleading for it to go through that process long time. It needs to be brought to speedy conclusion. And we also need urgently to address the facilities available for our constabulary personnel. There was a station out there in front of the penitentiary. That station was built, I believe, 1976, in the 70s. well, 78, between 76 and 80, the population of Spanish Town has expanded substantially. The station don't grow. And so the police personnel are forced to work in cramped circumstances, difficult conditions, and really, one of the reasons why when we had the discussions with the government, we were urging and still continue to urge that there needs to be a meeting with a wider group of stakeholders, is because the country is going to have to come to a consensus about the priorities for expenditure if we are to get on top of this problem of rampant criminality. And we're going to have to agree that provisions for the security forces, along with, in my view, education, are going to have to be at the top of the demands. And governments are going to have to resist the temptation to fill up the extra money that is coming forward with little political goodies to give away for partisan political purposes. Now is the time to spend the resources dealing with the long-term, hardcore problems that this country faces, and security is number one. I think we need to face that fact because everyone knows that growth, economic growth, is what we need. And that when you have a high crime environment, it stifles economic growth. Factories can run 2 shifts or 3 shifts because people are afraid to come out at night. Building sites, construction sites, factories, hotels have to spend a huge amount of money on security that their international competitors don't have to spend. Families face the hardship of sending children to school or going out to work, and therefore we even retarding the preparation of the labor force that we need, the workforce, to move the country forward. But I think I should also mention, and it's an important point as we consider states of emergency, that it has had a negative effect on the economic activity in the communities where it has been declared. It is why it can't be a long-term solution and wasn't intended to be. You know, one of the strange things, and it also breeds a kind of hostility in a country that is still too divided, is that sometimes the big businesses have been given a blind to open later, to operate. And the man with the cold supper shop, the pan chicken man, the soup man, is told that he must lock it down and can't operate. But the irony in it all, that after a while, if the pan chicken man not buying chicken, and the soup man not buying no meat and provisions, and the round robin not buying the beer and the liquor and the all of that. The big business itself will suffer because they buy their things from there. And so eventually, as the economic wheel spins, the sprocket gets damaged and it stops spinning smoothly, and the entire economic life of the community deteriorates, which in and of itself starts spawn more criminal activity and criminalism. So it becomes a self-defeating measure in and of itself. But there is a way forward. And the way forward is in building a sound consensus, tackling not the easy solution that it would seem by just locking up a whole heap of people, but by engaging in the difficult but necessary and sustained task of reform of our security arrangements. In the period since the end of the state of emergency here and the end in St. Andrew, we can take hope from the fact that the reduction in crime has been sustained. There are fewer murders at this period than there was last year at the same time. I want to urge again that the police and the security forces, the military, fulfill the commitment that was given directly to Mr. Jackson by the heads of the security forces, that the intensity of security force action and police presence would be maintained. Quite frankly, there is other legislation that can be used, including the Zozo legislation. My own view is that the government, who was insisting on passing the legislation rapidly last year, is not making sufficient use of the Zozo legislation. It was passed as a security measure. We welcome the social interventions. We started social interventions. We started CSJP and the others. And in fact, you know, one of the things I feel personally so proud of and satisfied about was that I was minister at the time when the Peace Management Initiative was started as a direct initiative, because it demonstrates a fundamental truth. In fact, the largest reduction in criminal violence last year occurred in the Central Kingston Police Division because of the activities of the Peace Management Initiative. We must not treat the communities of the poor as if they are hostile zones in our country. What these communities need is rehabilitation, not just of the physical facilities around, although that is very important, but almost a rehabilitation of the soul and consciousness and attitudes of the people in the communities. And you can accomplish that best of all by demonstrating that the authorities care and will reach out. A militaristic solution to the crime problem is not feasible in a free and democratic society. And that's the message I want to leave with you. Thank you very much.